ladies and gentlemen, this is John. Welcome back to another episode of our weekly show, The Subcontinent. Our program aims to address important issues in the subcontinent which affect the governments, people, organizations, and the region as a whole. We will try to explain the issues, break down controversies surrounding them, and try to have some external perspectives from experts and people.
In this edition of The Subcontinent, we will discuss what the normalizations of relations with Israel means for people and government of Bangladesh. And we shall also take a look at reactions of other nations across the subcontinent to the normalization deal with Israel.
The news of agreements on the normalization of relations between Israel and some Arab countries shocked the whole world. Apart from Pakistan and India, the largest and perhaps strongest subcontinental countries with higher stakes in the geopolitics of the region, there were reactions from other nations across the subcontinent. One of the ramifications of the US brokered deal is that countries feel pressed to calibrate their ties and priorities vis-à-vis Palestine and Israel.
With more than 150 million Muslims, Bangladesh is one of the most vocal countries about the Palestinian rights. Therefore, the news of the normalization deal with Israel was met with fury and fire.
People of Bangladesh, I think most of the people, even 100% people, support the cause of the Palestinian because from the very traditionally, historically, they support the cause of Bangladesh, and I didn't find any person against the Palestinians or supporting the Israel stand, and that's why I didn't find any difference of opinion on this issue that the cause of the Palestinians should be properly upheld.
Despite the lack of direct hostilities, Israel and Bangladesh have no economic, defense or diplomatic ties. However, Bangladeshi-Palestinian solidarity goes well beyond history and politics. Father of the nation Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was one of the supporters of independence for Palestine and even called it immoral to normalize relation with Israel without an independent Palestine. The world is divided in two, the exploiter and the exploited. We are in favor of the exploited. The people of Bangladesh are always beside the Palestinian people, Bangabandhu said.
People of Bangladesh didn't like this thing, that attempt, because the cause of the Palestinians is weakening because of that stand of some stand taken by the Arab countries to normalize the stand relation with Israel.
Back in 1972, Israel offered to recognize newly founded Bangladesh that was rejected without a second thought by Tajuddin Ahmed, the then premier of the country, which in 2021 will be 50 years old.
Despite a firm no to any overt or covert relation with Israeli regime, it is found in the recent years that Bangladeshi products are exported to the regime through the US or the European Union or other third countries. The global capitalism has made it possible for a few to benefit from such relations. But how can the Israeli regime ever be a friend of any Muslim country as the regime preaches intolerance towards Islam?
Given the common feeling in the Muslim-majority Bangladesh, it seems impossible for the government to have any kind of relations with Israel, or even welcome the Israeli government with the UAE and Bahrain. But no matter how suicidal for the government and Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, there are a number of Bangladeshi contractors, businessmen, sweatshop owners, or immigration middlemen who seek to manipulate the natural course and discourse of the country to make benefit from the normalization of ties with Israel.
People of Bangladesh very strongly support the cause of the Palestinians, and it is very much inherent in their thinking, feeling. So people of the government of Bangladesh will not go against the will of the people of this country, because Bangladesh is a country which always stands for justice, and the cause of the Palestinians very just claim. So I think Bangladesh will continue to support the cause of the Palestinians and will not normalize relation with Israel against the will of the people.
Normal people never give up the Palestinian hopes for money or under US or Saudi threats, but there are those who are willing to sacrifice all noble causes for profit. For them, sweatshop productions for the West shouldn't stop, natural gas and ecological resources should keep flowing to India, and the human labor business in the Persian Gulf Arab countries must flourish. This way, they make sure the Bangladeshi government or people cannot disturb the signatories of the so-called Abraham Accord.
Let's just take a look at how the global media has covered the issue.
Israel's limited diplomacy in South Asia helped it when Nepal and Bhutan abstained during the voting of UN General Assembly Resolution 3379, which described Israel's founding philosophy of Zionism as equivalent to racism. This resolution basically equaled Zionism with apartheid of South Africa, causing international isolation of the Jewish state. India, despite being a secret recipient of Israeli military support during 1962 and subsequently, has supported the resolution on November 10, 1975. Netanyahu gave up on the legal enactment of annexation, but he is still pursuing the process of annexation, perpetuating complete domination over the West Bank and its residents, Michael Svard, a lawyer who advises human rights groups in Israel, said. The UAE have not received any assurance that Israel will not expand settlements, establish new ones, or consolidate the Israeli bureaucracy in the territory, he added. Although Nepal was the first South Asian country to establish diplomatic relations with Israel and the two enjoy a strong relationship, Kathmandu says it recognizes the rights of the Palestinians. The Nepali government has voted in favor of Palestine recognition and against the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital at the United Nations, but has always tried not to appear against the US or Israel, as the country is constantly under threats of aid cut by the US authorities. After voting in favor of a UN General Assembly resolution criticizing the US move to shift its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Nepali officials defended their decision as consistent with the country's historic position on Israel and Palestine and not exactly against Washington. Bhutan is one of those countries who have stopped taking any steps in the direction of accepting the existence of Israel as a nation. Israel doesn't seem to be a particularly high priority for Thimphu, as the kingdom has no diplomatic relations even with its northern neighbor, China.
The proponents of the Israeli formalization say that the deal immediately stops the annexation of the West Bank. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has shattered their illusion. Such an agreement can never put restraint on the expansionist Israeli policies, but would further help the Israeli regime expand beyond the land it has already occupied.
का बहुत गलबा बढ़ गया है दुनिया में, और टेक्नोलॉजी, सरमाया और फासिज्म एक साथ आ गया है. उसकी अक्कासी ये गल्फ़ कंट्रीज़ में भी हो रही है, और अभी इज़राइल का इशू जो क्रिएट किया गया मसनूई तौर पर, उसको बग़ैर हल किए सारी ज़मीन फ़लस्तीन से छीन ली गई, उनकी डिग्निटी ख़त्म कर दी गई, और एक ज़्यादती जो इंसानियत की तारीख़ में हमेशा लिखी रहेगी, उसको बग़ैर हल किए जिस तरह से अरब भाइयों ने ही फ़लस्तीन भाइयों को धोखा दिया है, वो काबिल मज़म्मत भी है और अफसोसनाक भी है.
ये देखिए, ये बहुत पुरानी बात है और ये कोई नया टॉपिक नहीं है. अरब इसराइल का रिलेशंस तो शुरू से ही कंट्रोवर्शियल रहा है, और जो इसराइल की पॉलिसी है उसको जो है वर्ल्ड जो है यानी पूरी दुनिया उसको समझ नहीं पा रही है. क्योंकि वो पसे पर्दा रख करके अपनी आइडियोलॉजी को रखना चाहती है। इसराइल का प्लान है ग्रेटर इसराइल बनाना।
देखिए, इसराइल का एक लंबा प्रोग्राम है। वो प्रोग्राम है उनकी जो कंसिस्टेंसी है पॉलिसी में, वो किसी भी तरह से ग्रेटर इसराइल बनाना चाहते हैं। पूरी उनका एक मैप है और उसमें उनका पहला जो कदम है वो ये है कि पूरे फ़िलिस्तीन को उनको अपने कंट्रोल में लेना है। वो तकरीबन उन्होंने ले लिया है। छोटे छोटे से पैबंद रह गए हैं जो गाज़ा में हैं या वेस्ट बैंक में हैं। तो उसके बाद अब उन्होंने आईएस खड़ा किया है, जिसके तहत उस खित्ते में ऐसी बदअमनी पैदा कर दी है कि कोई भी शख्स अब उस इलाके में इज़राइल का मुकाबला करने वाला नहीं रह गया है। और अब उनकी जो हुकूमतें नहीं बनी हैं वो पपेट्स ही हैं जो अमेरिका के इशारे पे इज़राइल के ही मकसद को पूरा करने के लिए काम कर रही हैं।
There are numerous reports about clandestine relations with Israel, but most countries never dared to tarnish their image with association to the atrocities committed by the Israeli regime. However, the agreement for formal recognition of diplomatic ties by the UAE and Bahrain can serve as a pilot operation devised by the US and Saudi Arabia to check the global response and encourage others to follow suit.
Like many countries that cannot bear the stigma of formal ties with Israel, Maldives has had an on-again, off-again relations with the Zionist regime. The Muslim country established diplomatic relations with Israel in 1965 and suspended them in 1974. In 2009, under President Mohammed Nasheed, the Maldives signed cooperation agreements with Israel on tourism, health, and education and culture. However, the renewed relationship did not develop into full diplomatic relations. In July 2014, under President Abdullah Yamin, the Maldives terminated the cooperation agreements with Israel and announced a boycott of Israeli products as Israel launched a military operation in Gaza. Following the announcement of the agreement with Israel, the Maldivian foreign minister expressed support for the Palestinians and denied having talks with Israel. Dunya Mamun underscored that Mali would fully back Palestine at international forums such as the United Nations Human Rights Council. Sri Lankan's ties with Israel follow a similar path. President Jayawardenene established ties with Israel. They were suspended under President Premadasa but restored in 2000. In February this year, Israel offered Sri Lanka technology in various sectors, which was welcomed by the newly elected President Rajapaksa, but in June, the Sri Lankan government raised concerns over the human rights situation in Palestine and called on Israel to halt annexation activities in the occupied territories.
Now, to learn more about this issue, we are joined by Mr. Zafar Bangash. He is the director of the Institute of Contemporary Islamic Thought. Mr. Bangash, welcome to the subcontinent. So, how much do you think the people of the subcontinent support the Palestinian cause?
The people of the subcontinent are overwhelmingly in favor of the Palestinian people's struggle for self-determination. There are, of course, many reasons for that. These relate to the fact that when we talk about Muslims, for instance, for them, Palestine, the Holy Land, as well as Al-Quds, Masjid al-Aqsa, hold enormous spiritual significance. Secondly, for them, Palestine is also important because it is closely linked in the minds of the people in the subcontinent with the struggle of the people of Kashmir. And both struggles obviously date back to the same time, back to 1947, and the same colonialist power, Britain, that was behind these intrigues that have caused such enormous suffering, both to the Palestinian people as well as the people of Kashmir. So this is, first of all, on the from the Muslim perspective. There is also, of course, another factor, and that is that the people of the subcontinent are, generally speaking, quite well informed about international relations. unlike, for instance, people in the Middle East. And of course, they have governments over there that are very oppressive, that do not allow the people to express their views. But the people of the subcontinent are not only quite free to express their views, also they are not afraid to express their views and to express their sentiments. So all of these factors combined go towards heightening the awareness as well as the concern of the people of the subcontinent towards the struggle of the Palestinian people, as well as the liberation of Palestine.
Okay, so you're saying that the issue is similar to the Kashmir issue, and Muslims particularly are in overwhelming support of the Palestinian people. And there are reports that in the 1980s, thousands of Bangladeshi youth volunteered to fight for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. What is behind such massive support for Palestine? Can we say that they understand the settler colonial project since they themselves lived under colonial rule?
Well, there is no doubt that the experience of the people of the subcontinent under colonialism has played a significant role in shaping their thinking. But I think we need to keep in mind that the struggle for Palestine or the support of the people of the subcontinent for the struggle in Palestine, as well as other Islamic causes. For instance, in the 1920s, there was what came to be called the Khilafat movement, when the Turks abolished the Ottoman Khilafah. There was a massive movement in the subcontinent at the time, although it was under British colonialism, but people were extremely angry with that, and they wanted to struggle, go to Turkey and to strive to see if the Khilafah could be saved. So there is a very long history in the subcontinent of people's awareness. And of course, they also realized that colonialism has played a very negative and destructive role in many of these areas, whether it's in Palestine, in Kashmir, in Cyprus, a number of other places in the world. And so there is a deep understanding and appreciation of the struggle of people for justice and for their fundamental rights. And that is what explains their deep attachment, even though I don't think we should look at it from a nationalistic point of view, because the people in the subcontinent, especially the Muslims, of course, they look upon themselves as being part of one ummah, and that is what they express in terms of their empathy and support for the Palestinian cause.
Mr. Pankaj, before we take the next question, let's just take a look at how the global media has covered the issue.
There are hundreds of Bangladeshis who fought for Palestinian self-determination and are buried in Palestinian Liberation Organization (PLO) graves in Lebanon. During the 1982 Lebanon War, 400 Bangladeshi fighters were captured by the Israeli military. Fathi Abu al-Iradat, a PLO secretary, estimated around 1,000 to 1,500 Bangladeshi fighters were involved in the war. In 1987, the Bangladeshi government estimated that around 8,000 Bangladeshi youths had volunteered to fight for the PLO following Arafat's visit to the country. It should be clear that Bangladesh is not against Jews, it is only against Israel's occupation of Palestine. Bangladesh generously recognized few Jews for their contribution to Bangladesh. Among them, General J.F.R. Jacob, architect Louis I. Kahn are mentionable. Jewish military officer Jacob played a vital role in providing military assistance to Bengali guerrillas in 1971. He was recognized as a friend of liberation war by Bangladesh. The famous Jewish architect Louis I. Kahn, who designed our visually pleasing Parliament building, is remembered warmly here in Dhaka. Export Promotion Bureau (EPB) data shows that in fiscal year 2012 to 2013, Bangladesh has exported goods worth about $22,435 to Israel, while in 2011 to 2012, the amount was $8,364. The maximum amount of exports took place in 2011 when export earning fetched $30,545. And in 2009 to 2010, the amount was $17,861. During these years under review, Bangladesh mainly exported apparel, knit and textile products to Israel. Besides garments items, some ceramic items were also exported. Israel imported $17,571 and $26,558 in 2012 and 2013 respectively.
All right, welcome back, Mr. Bangash, and welcome back to the audience as well. So, Mr. Bangash, you said that there's a long history of colonial rule, and that certainly has an impact on the way things run in the subcontinent. Would the normalization of relations between some Arab countries and Israel impact the geopolitics of the subcontinent?
Yes, this is true that most of the countries of the subcontinent have very close ties with the Persian Gulf countries as well as Saudi Arabia. And then you have India, which is the largest of the countries in the region, that has also very deep ties with the Zionist state of Israel. Now, as far as the people are concerned, I don't think that they will support any normalization with the Zionist occupying regime, because for them, Palestine, Al-Quds, and Masjid al-Aqsa are very dear to them, and they will continue to strive and struggle regardless of how their governments conduct their affairs. Of course, in the subcontinent, these governments are, or these countries are to a large extent dependent on their expatriate labor force in the Persian Gulf countries. But I think when it comes to the crunch, I think the governments, and I can say this quite safely with respect to Pakistan, for instance, it will not compromise on this principle. India, of course, already has compromised, but I'm not suggesting that the people or the overwhelming majority of people in India have accepted that policy. But in Pakistan, I can say with great confidence that both the people and the government will not compromise on the issue of Palestine. Now, of course, for the people, they have a sentimental attachment to Palestine. For the government, it also has a political dimension in the sense that if the government of Pakistan were to accept normalization of relations with the Zionist state of Israel, then it would have to accept that India's occupation of Kashmir is legitimate. And that's something that Pakistan simply will not accept. And so we see that even though there may be challenges and difficulties for governments in the subcontinent, as far as the people are concerned, they simply will not compromise.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bangash, for being with us on our show. It was nice having you here. Viewers, let's see how people on social media see this situation.
As a Nepalese, Irmak Aidoya declares his support for the Palestinians and considers the Israeli regime as the worst threat to security. This tweet provides a very brief overview of Sri Lanka-Palestine relations. This user shares some pictures of the Palestinians in the West Bank. And finally, let's take a look at the picture shared by Shadi describing the current situation of Gaza and the Palestinians.
And that was our episode covering the reactions of different nations across the subcontinent to the recognition of Israel. To watch bits of our episodes and more updates, follow us on our social media platforms and make sure to give us feedback about what you think. We'll meet the same time, same day next week.